Okay, this is May the 12th, 2008. We are honored today to be with Mr. Andy Horning, candidate for governor of Indiana. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Well, I'm honored to be here.
First of all, let's start it off. A lot of people are confused about what a libertarian is.
Well, I guess the first question ought to be, what is a Democrat and Republican anymore? And that's kind of the frustrating question for anybody who claims to be a Democrat or Republican. I think everybody would have to admit the parties have strayed. Now, one thing I can say about libertarians is that that's the only party I am aware of that still has anything like a pledge or an oath. And the libertarian pledge is basically to nonviolence, or essentially that the force of politics, the armed force, the violence of government should be limited. And I believe it should be limited constitutionally by written laws. That's called the rule of law. But however it's articulated, all libertarians believe in nonviolence. No violence against the individual. The legitimate use of government violence is to protect against theft, murder, rape, things like that. And so what's interesting about all of this is that no matter how you articulate this nonviolence thing, it's the philosophy and practice of the Founding Fathers. It's what built this nation. And so libertarian is what the founders were. It's what the Enlightenment philosophers were. The whole movement towards liberty and justice for all was, by definition, libertarian. And so what a libertarian is, I guess, you can say we're the throwbacks, but we're still the newest thing going. We're still the only fresh idea in human history to put a leash on politics and to keep the historic violence of government. The history of government is, slavery, genocide, oppression, and war. And it's not, about nice things like park benches and nice little schools with picket fences. So what we are about is about what works. And what the other guys are about is what has always failed and what has always failed miserably.
Now, a lot of people we've talked to, a lot of voters out there in general, they can't tell the difference between a Democrat and a Republican. They look alike, they talk alike.
Why would you be able to tell the difference? Yeah. Well, honestly, the history of the Democrat and Republican parties is not what most people think it is either. In fact, we've pretty much got it backwards. The traditional conservatives were the Democrats for many, many years. And the traditional, what we now call liberals, were the Republicans. The first tree-hugging liberal was Teddy Roosevelt, who proposed anti-corporate laws, income tax, universal health care. The guy was actually very much a liberal in the modern sense of that word. Mm-hmm. And that's not the image people have of the GOP or Teddy Roosevelt. But truth be known, Hoover, who preceded FDR, was the guy who really formulated most of the New Deal. And even FDR called Hoover a socialist in 1932. And so we really have not gotten the history straight. And the last president to give us a really huge tax cut, still the biggest tax cut of all time, the last president to cut spending after an extremely expensive president was JFK. That's not the image people think.
Now, a lot of people also confuse the idea of a libertarian with a liberal.
Well, yeah. And that liberal versus conservative term, like a Democrat and Republican, right versus left, that's been abused to the point where it just has no meaning anymore. Mm-hmm. I really don't know how, in the classical liberal sense, I guess libertarians are the classical liberals, but then we're talking 200 years ago, and the meaning of the word was entirely different. Now, I guess we would have to say we are far more conservative than the conservatives. There's nothing conservative, or nothing that conserves about war. There's nothing conservative in any kind of sense about spending like crazy. Libertarians are the only, I guess we're sort of the last standing fiscal conservatives, and that we really do believe that your money is yours, that government needs to keep their hands off of it, and that we need to keep whatever the government spends and takes under very close watch, because we, frankly, do not trust politicians with our money.
Now, also, part of your campaign slogan is to govern government.
Correct.
Tell us a little more about this slogan, what it means.
Well, to govern government is kind of the opposite of what the other guys want to do. They want to govern you, and so they convince you that they are best able to rule you. They know what's best for you. They know what's best for the world. They know how best to take care of us. Where we reject all of that and say that history is very clear on one thing, that politics is dangerous and that it works best when it's put on a leash. And if we consider what the role of government is, which is violence, and we need that role from time to time to bash the heads of criminals and foreign enemies and so on when necessary, it's violence, and we don't want to introduce violence where it doesn't need to be. We need to govern that government. Governing means to restrain. And there is, when we think of government these days, we don't think about restraint. We think about power without any limits. We think about ungoverned power. That's really anarchy. And I guess what's frustrating is that a lot of people would think that a lot of people term libertarians as the anarchists. They would think that we don't believe in government. Oh, you're anti-government. We're the ones who are for government. We want to restrain government. We want to put it in paper, in print. We want to have our rules written down that everybody obeys without exception. So the governing government, is really the only way things should ever work. Why should we as citizens have to obey written laws as written? You have to do 55 in a 55. You have to do no more than 70 in a 70-mile-an-hour zone. Why is that so important that we behave these laws when we let politicians run amok? For instance, if I break a speed limit, or God forbid if I do something really horrible, if I decide to become a murderer or a thief, I can break in a door, I can steal some things, but I don't take the house. Government takes your house too. I might be able to kill some people, but not nearly in the numbers that politicians do. And any crime that you can think of that can be committed by an individual is made much worse when it's a politician doing it. So the idea of governing citizens really doesn't make much sense in reference to history, where our biggest, most violent, horrific episodes are not when some guys or even a group of guys kick in some doors and commit violence. And frankly, the more government turns up the screws on citizens, the worse our crime gets. Our crime rates were a fraction of what they are now back 100 years ago, when we had far less intrusion from our government.
Now, we have seen the results in our group and other groups about the Big Brother syndrome. DCS coming in saying, oh, we're going to take care of you. We'll make you feel so much better. We'll raise you from the cradle to the grave. This is not what our founding fathers had in mind.
No. And in fact, it's kind of a joke now. That phrase, we're from the government and we're here to help, it's a very sad joke, unfortunately. And when you consider what happens with the so-called child protective services, when they actually have like a bounty system, where they get paid. The state gets paid for every child introduced into the system. And when you consider human nature and what that really tends to do with any bureaucracy, the results are horrific. Why do we have a bureaucracy that doesn't have to obey the same rules that other branches of government have to? Why is it that they have their own legislative, judicial, and executive forces within this bureaucracy? Why do they not have to obey, the typical rules of due process? And this is all very wrong. And to have that kind of power in any organization, whether it's related to Child Protective Services or the IRS or anything else, is horribly wrong. And when you're talking about children, you get a multi-generational effect where, once you have ruined some kids' lives like this, the tendency for that to propagate into a new cultural phenomenon is just something we should never have started.
We just now got done posting on our website a family that has had the public children's services in their lives for the last 45 years. The grandfather was taken away, the father was taken away, now the grandson's been taken away. If you're elected governor, and God, I hope you are, what could we expect to see in the first 30 days of your office?
Well, the very first day, maybe moments after the swearing-in ceremony, I would, if the cameras are still there, if I've got a microphone, I'm going to put people on notice that we will do the Constitution as written. And the Constitutions as written do not authorize the government to do what it's been doing to us. In specific reference to this bureaucracy, I see no reason that we couldn't use the rest of our court system, our legal, we have police, we have courts, we have defense lawyers, we have all of the things necessary to using proper restraint and with respect to property rights, parents' rights, children's health. With respect to all of our rights, we can help children and do it in a way that's not inherently compromised by these rules that have horrible unintended consequences coming from both the state and federal government levels. So, to specifically answer your question, the only authorizing contract in the state for the use of government force is the Constitution. That Constitution specifies that the only person empowered to execute that Constitution is the executive branch. I, as governor, would be the executive. I would not allow any force to be coming out of the state in any sense. No bureaucracy. There would be no force used to do this DCS. It's not constitutional. The laws that breathed it into existence were illegal. And unless the Constitution were to be amended, there's no legal basis for a government to be able to do this kind of thing to people. So to answer your question even more directly, it would go away.
So with no state agency, it would fall back to the county agency to deal with these problems individually.
Well, you say agencies, and that's also there are lots of agencies that are also problematic constitutionally. But we do have all of the authority with existing constitutional, the constitutionally derived powers, and there are plenty of them. Police, courts already have all the power they need. If they see a problem, they can get a warrant. They can kick in a door when that use of force is warranted, and they can snatch a child away if that use of force is warranted. But they have to go through the proper channels, and they have to do this. It makes no sense to direct this from higher levels of government. The higher you go, the less likely it is that you know the specific circumstances involved. And where we used to have a lot of involvement with local churches and local law enforcement officers, street officers that knew these people very well, and they would be able to better say, oh, they look rough, but they're okay people. Mm-hmm. Or, the house looks dirty, but those kids are raised great. Mm-hmm. We don't have that kind of structure anymore, and instead we have rules. And these rules come down awfully heavy-handed in this bureaucracy where they, have all kinds of ways to go after kids based on sanitary rules and things that really don't have basis in reality, and then ignore the fact that once kids do get sucked up into this government system, the things that really happen to them after that are horrible. And we often forget that part of it. What happens to these kids after they're in foster homes? And that's not a very happy story sometimes.
Now, we've done some studies of our own, and we're getting ready to publish this one. We've interviewed 288 young women that have survived foster care. And over 80% of them end up in the adult industry, prostitutes, strippers, things of this nature. So we're producing a fine generation of prostitutes, strippers, and 80%. And most of these young ladies are told they're worthless, they're scum, things of this nature. Now, we just had, unfortunately in Indiana, we had another death in foster care. Mm-hmm. This makes the fourth one in 5 months. The other three, Judge Payne says, Mr. Payne, the current director of DCS, has said, oh, there was no rules broken, DCS is doing a fine job. What's your take on this?
Well, I can't comment on specific cases. The numbers sound horrible. On the face of it, it sounds awful. Now, I don't want to make a judgment based on, initial reaction sometimes is not correct. Given the number of kids that go through the system, I guess I'd have to see the total picture. But I've already told you what I think of the structure itself. And the fact that I think we have a society that so badly undervalues the individual and the way individuals work. And that the way we think of success is so badly twisted. We think that you have to be processed through the school system in this correct way in order to come up with the best result. When history shows that never happens that way. It just doesn't work. And that, our vision for the future is a bad one. It's a nightmare. The old way of doing things in the most ancient sense, And I'm not talking about, like good old days of America. I'm talking about from the very beginning. What humans have been all about is this kind of authoritarian, heavy-handed, brutish thuggishness. And I find it horrific that we keep going back to this native, brutish default, and we call it the glorious future, where we have these bureaucrats and politicians who might as well be wearing animal skins and carrying clubs. The primitive way that they beat people into submission, they have these rules that just come out as edicts. They carve them into stone for us, but they don't obey any laws themselves. And this is just awful. So while I don't want to comment on an individual circumstance, because I don't really know the case well, I can say in broad brushstrokes that I've seen enough about the way things go on, and I know enough about history, and I know enough about the way government works in general, and I've just seen enough to say that this is desperately wrong. Plus, it's illegal. Just reading the Constitution is all you need to do in order to say that if this is going to happen this way, we need to modify the Constitution. If we want the DCS the way it is, we have to rewrite something. We have to amend the Constitution. And so there is no authority in government now to do this brutishness. And as it stands right now, I see no reason to offer any exceptions. It would have to just go away.
Now, we know the DCS is not in the state constitution. What other agencies are not in the state constitution that would be affected?
Well, there are an awful lot of them. The fact that there is no authorization for government to prohibit gambling on one hand, but then to run gambling operations on the other hand, and then sell gambling operations in order to pay for colleges, which ironically are not in the Constitution either. And we have this common school system that is in the Constitution that we're not doing, and we have a public school system that's not at all in the Constitution. And I guess I hardly even know where to begin just talking about how many things would have to be changed. Now, if I keep rattling on like that, it's going to sound like, what I want to do is just throw everything out, and then that'll sound like a negative thing. But I don't want to give that impression, because really what this is all about is freedom and opportunity and having more options available to people. What government does is it removes options. So when we're talking about these agencies, when we're talking about these programs, when we're talking about schools, we're not talking about here is something. What we're talking about is this is competing with every other option out there. So that if you're using your money to pay for a public school system, you're not using it for other competing kinds of educational opportunities that might be better. And in fact, I think homeschoolers are demonstrating very amply that there are competitive options out there that are better. And so when we have roads that we have subsidized with taxes, and the corruption in the road funding system is well known, you also have to understand that's why we don't have public transportation, because we have competed with the alternative and we've killed it. So the fact that every time we have a new agency or a new power, we have eliminated all the other options, that's the thing I most want to express. So yes, there would be a lot of things that would have to go. They're not in the Constitution. They're wrong. They're not working. It's a dysfunctional system. We have an economic problem in our country right now that everybody's feeling in their pocketbook, and this is a bad time for government to get bigger and more expensive. So on the very practical level, we need to cut some things anyway. But if we do that, I don't want anybody to think that's a negative. This is a huge positive. What we're allowing is for what made this nation great. We just got passed by Europe as the #1 economy in the world. We could take that back again very easily if we would just do what we did before, and that is turn our entrepreneurs loose, turn our teachers loose. Let people who want to do things do them. Let teachers teach. Let businessmen do business. And let politicians stay on their side of the fence.
It seems to me that the idea of big government today is to make big government bigger.
Well, that's the tendency. In fact, Jefferson said it better than I could, and I wish I could remember it exactly. But basically, he said something along the line that it is the nature of government. The tendency of government is to grow while liberty recedes. And that's just the way history has always worked, where we have a default state. And I've always likened this to something like dental hygiene, where you can't ever be done brushing your teeth. You can't brush your teeth once and say, well, there, done. now I've got a lifetime of good dental hygiene ahead of me. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to keep brushing your teeth. And the same thing is true of politicians. They're just like, gum disease. You have to brush them away. You can imagine all kinds of good things for politicians. You can imagine all kinds of wonderful roles for them to play. But you got to be realistic. That's not the way history works. And the tendency for us to allow these things to accumulate is very strong. We tend to bow down to the golden calf. We tend to have our idols. We tend to do this silly thing with politicians where we keep trusting them with more and more and more. And you have to brush them away. And you have to do it without stop. And that's where the constitutions are so helpful. It gives you an objective guideline. You say, this is what you're authorized to do. Nothing else. And if you follow it as it's written, which was the way they were supposed to be followed, no interpretations from the bench, no playing with the meaning of the word, is. The fact is, the laws are well known, they're written down, and they work. We know they work. So if we do these laws, we'll be doing better than we're doing right now, because we know that what we're doing right now doesn't work.
Now, about you personally, we know you're a father. But tell us a little more about yourself. I know homeschooling is very important to you.
Well, I say we homeschool. Who am I kidding? My wife does all of the homeschooling, so I support her 100%, and she supports me 100%. That works out really well. It's a lifestyle choice that's not for everybody, I understand. But we live on a small farm in Indiana, down in Freedom, Indiana. Where else, I guess. And we have kind of a typical little farm homestead where I'm not a real farmer. I know nothing about it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm I don't even have enough calluses on my hands to claim too much about that. But I've got 5 children and 1 daughter, so I've got 4 boys. My wife is a wonderful, patient woman who allows me to run for office and supports me all the way. As far as what I'm all about, I'm not different from anybody else, with the exception that I had some things happen early on in my life that just got my gall up. And what I did is, instead of what most people do, where you just kind of get so disgusted, you turn away and you just say, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not going to fight. I guess what's different about me is I got a little bit uppity. And in my own little way, I started to fight. I started to write articles, letters, columns in newspapers, and I've run for office. Anybody can do this. I wish more people would. There's nothing special about me. It's just, I even have a horrible fear of public speaking. It's just one of those things that, if you don't like something, I don't understand why Americans, this proud people that used to have a fighting spirit and used to defend their liberties, I don't know why all of a sudden we became this people that just bow our heads and take it. And I'm just not like that.
I'm looking forward to hearing your inaugural address, because Daniels and all the other politicians have been so long-winded. And you're going to make it nice, short, and sweet, saying, we're going to do better, thank you.
Well, you say that, but then I guess I have to admit, I've had a tendency to rattle on too. You say brevity, and that's not how people would have described me. In years past, I guess I've always been one. I've been into history. I've been into the rule of law. I'm into sort of the details of it, and I have a tendency to go off. But I will take your suggestion for brevity, and I will try to make a brief inaugural address. But I think the thing that I'm most looking forward to is the opportunity to make any inaugural address, long or short. What that would mean is that, in fact, let me just kind of couch this differently. No election is ever about the candidate, ever. It's a choice, and the choice is not my choice; it's voters' choice. Leaders don't really lead; they reflect. Government doesn't really govern us so much as it reflects who we are. And we have become a very tolerant, very submissive people. And if I were to win the governor's race in Indiana, what that would mean is that people have changed their mind. They've had an epiphany. They've realized, whoa, Nellie, something's going on here, and we need to put on the brakes. We need to change this. And so let's vote for this guy, because that is what we want. So it's not about me. It would have to be about the voters.
I like your wording. I don't ever see Governor Daniels or Miss Long saying, whoa, Nellie. You're a very common claim man, and that's wonderful. And God bless you. We'd like to thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank you for the opportunity to do this interview. And we look forward to seeing you occupy that big building down there with the gold dome really soon.
Thank you.
Take care of yourself.
You too.